Early January 1945, in the damp, utilitarian corridors of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, in Versailles, General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced the gravest command crisis of the Second World War. The military situation on the Western Front was, for the first time in months, firmly in Allied favor. The German surprise offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, had been contained and pushed back. Yet the real danger was no longer the Wehrmacht. It was erupting from within his own headquarters, threatening to tear the Anglo-American alliance apart at the very moment of impending victory. His most senior British Field Marshal, Bernard Montgomery, had just publicly insulted the courage and competence of the entire American army. In response, Eisenhower's top American generals, Omar Bradley and George S. Patton, were in open mutiny, threatening mass resignation. And now, with breathtaking audacity, Montgomery was demanding that Eisenhower permanently hand over command of two entire American armies, over 500,000 men, to him. Eisenhower wasn't just studying battle maps, he was carrying the colossal weight of a coalition cracking under the strain of success and personality. He sat, weary and besieged, between volcanic American fury and serene British insistence, a lonely arbiter in a war within the war. This was no longer a mere operational decision. It was a solitary, desperate battle to keep the Western Alliance from consuming itself before the final victory over Nazi Germany could be secured. He could not fire Montgomery without provoking a political rupture with Winston Churchill and the British Empire. He could not grant Montgomery's demand without triggering the collapse of the American command structure and his own moral authority. His solution was a masterpiece of pressured statecraft, a compromise that would satisfy no one completely, but might, just might, keep everyone in the fight. He would offer Montgomery a single American army for a single operation, the crossing of the Rhine. No permanent command, no overarching strategic authority. One army for one river. Montgomery would have to choose, accept this humiliatingly reduced role, or lose all influence over American forces forever. As the crisp January cold settled over France, Eisenhower drafted the orders and waited for the answer that would decide the fate of the final campaign in the West. 2. A certain clarification, the press conference that broke the alliance. The crisis was ignited not on a battlefield, but in a makeshift press room on January 7, 1945. Fresh from what he perceived as his masterful stabilization of the northern shoulder of the Bulge, Field Marshal Montgomery held a conference for journalists. Flush with self-assurance, he embarked on what he termed a certain clarification of the recent battle. With patronizing clarity, Montgomery painted a picture of chaos and rescue. He described how, when the Germans attacked, the American front had been broken and the situation confused. He, Montgomery, had been called upon to rally the broken forces, step in and tidy up the battlefield. He spoke of how he had headed off the Germans and seen off the threat, organizing a coherent defense from disarray. The narrative was unmistakable. When the Americans panicked, the calm, professional British leadership had saved the day. To Montgomery, this was simply stating the obvious facts of command. To every American soldier, from private to general, it was a profound and galling insult. The Battle of the Bulge had been, in its initial horrific week, an American tragedy and an American fight. Units like the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, the 7th Armored at St. Vith, and countless infantry divisions had been cut off, surrounded, and mauled, but they had held with a tenacity that bled the German spearheads white. The 19,000 American dead in the Ardennes were not testament to disarray, but to sacrificial, desperate courage. The reaction was instantaneous and furious. American newspapers erupted with headlines accusing Montgomery of stealing valor. Veterans organizations flooded the War Department with cables of protest. but the most dangerous fallout was within the high command. General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. 12th Army Group and a man of quiet but immense pride, was apoplectic. His men had borne the brunt of the attack, and his leadership was being implicitly condemned. He contacted Eisenhower directly. The message was stark. He would resign his command rather than continue to serve in a structure that left his armies vulnerable to such public contempt from a superior. His loyalty to Eisenhower was absolute, but his loyalty to his soldiers was paramount. The news reached General Patton, whose Third Army had executed the legendary relief of Bastogne and the northward counterblow. Patton, never one for subtlety, declared to Bradley that if Bradley resigned, he would resign as well. "I won't serve under that bastard," was the essence of his sentiment. For Patton, this was the final straw in a long saga of perceived British condescension and operational timidity. He had just executed one of the most brilliant operational maneuvers of the war, turning an entire army 90 degrees in a blizzard to attack, and now a man who had advanced with glacial caution since Normandy was claiming credit for the victory. The threat was no longer theoretical. Eisenhower was facing the concerted resignation of his two principal American army groups. The chain reaction would likely pull down other senior American officers, paralyzing the command structure of the entire Western Front. Churchill's deepest fear, an open fracture in the Allied high command, was on the verge of realization. The gravity of the situation was made terrifyingly clear to Montgomery by his own man. His brilliant and perceptive chief of staff, Major General Freddie de Gangden, flew to SHAEF. There, from Eisenhower's inner circle, he learned the unvarnished truth. Eisenhower, pushed to the brink by Bradley's ultimatum and political pressure from Washington, had actually drafted formal orders for Montgomery's relief. His career as a field commander in the war was hanging by a thread, severed by his own words. De Gangden raced back to Montgomery's headquarters. In a tense, private meeting, he laid out the facts. Eisenhower's patience was exhausted, American solidarity was absolute, and Montgomery was about to be sacked. The field marshal, who lived in a world of absolute certainty, was confronted with a consequence he had not foreseen. Grudgingly, under de Gangden's urgent coaching, he drafted a letter of apology to Eisenhower on January 8th. The apology was a masterpiece of non-apology. It expressed regret for any misunderstanding his words may have caused, claiming he was devastated to think he had offended his American comrades. It was crafted for survival, not for contrition. It worked. Eisenhower, desperate for any off-ramp from the crisis, accepted it. The relief orders were shelved, but the damage was deep and structural. Trust, the essential glue of coalition warfare, had been irreparably broken. And now, with the immediate crisis of his dismissal averted, Montgomery prepared to make his next move, a move that would leverage the temporary command he had just nearly lost into a permanent one.
During the desperate days of the Bulge, Eisenhower had made a purely military decision. The German breakthrough had effectively split Bradley's 12th Army Group in two. Bradley's headquarters, located in Luxembourg, had lost reliable communication with the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies north of the Bulge. Montgomery's 21st Army Group headquarters, however, was well placed to coordinate the defense in the northern sector. For the sake of operational coherence in a crisis, Eisenhower temporarily placed those two American armies, 1st Army under Courtney Hodges and 9th Army under the capable, steady William Big Simp Simpson under Montgomery's command. It was always understood by Eisenhower and Bradley to be a temporary emergency measure. To Montgomery, it was a revelation and an opportunity. He had long championed the single-thrust strategy, the belief that Allied resources should be concentrated under one commander, himself, for a powerful, narrow-front assault into the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, and then on to Berlin. He had argued for this since Normandy, clashing constantly with Eisenhower's preferred broad front strategy of advancing on a wider line to destroy German forces west of the Rhine. Now, in the aftermath of the Bulge, Montgomery saw his chance. He had, in his view, proven his point. When the Americans got into trouble, they needed a firm British hand. Furthermore, he now physically commanded the forces needed for his northern thrust. Why give them back? Within days of his near firing, Montgomery met with Eisenhower. He presented his case not as a request, but as a strategic imperative. The broad front, he argued, was a costly dissipation of strength. The Americans in the South, Patton's Third Army and the newly formed Sixth and Seventh Armies were making slow progress in the Saar and Alsace. All effort, all logistics should be funneled to the north. To achieve the decisive breakthrough, he needed to retain permanent command of both the 1st and 9th U.S. Armies. His own British and Canadian forces, he admitted with rare candor, were exhausted and depleted after 5 years of war. They lacked the manpower for the final, brutal push. American strength was not just helpful, it was essential. Eisenhower listened, as he always did, with a calm, impassive face. When Montgomery finished, Eisenhower's reply was simple and final. The command arrangement had been temporary. The armies would return to Bradley's command. The broad front strategy would continue. Montgomery was stunned. He saw this not as a strategic disagreement, but as a political surrender. Eisenhower, in his view, was sacrificing military logic to placate American national pride. He left the meeting in a cold fury, convinced the Allied cause was being jeopardized by sentiment. He was half right. It was about American pride, but it was also about fundamental command authority. Bradley's position had crystallized into an unshakable principle. The temporary transfer during the Bulge was one thing, making it permanent was an entirely different proposition. To Bradley, it meant accepting that American armies, the product of American industry and manned by American citizens, would be used to pursue a British-designed strategy under a British commander who openly disparaged their abilities. It was a negation of the very idea of a partnership of equals. Bradley made his stand clear to Eisenhower. If Montgomery kept those armies, he, Bradley, would have no army group to command. He would not be a mere spectator. He would resign. Patton's supporting threat gave this ultimatum the force of an avalanche. The message to Eisenhower was brutal in its clarity. You can keep Montgomery happy, or you can keep your American command structure. You cannot have both. At this moment, Winston Churchill, the master politician, intervened. Churchill understood the stakes better than Montgomery. He saw beyond the operational map to the tectonic shift in power. The United States was now the dominant partner. Its armies dwarfed Britain's. Its industrial output was overwhelming. A direct confrontation with Eisenhower, and by extension President Roosevelt, was a battle Britain could not win. But total capitulation was also unacceptable. It would mean Britain receding into a purely supporting role for the final act of the European War. Churchill proposed a classic political compromise to Eisenhower. Split the difference. Let Montgomery keep the U.S. Ninth Army for the forthcoming major operation, the assault crossing of the Rhine. Return the U.S. First Army to Bradley immediately. This would give Montgomery the American muscle he insisted he needed for the set-piece battle, while restoring the bulk of American forces to American command. It was a face-saving measure for all, though it pleased none entirely. Eisenhower seized upon it, but he, as Supreme Commander, added the critical binding condition that would define the next 3 months. He summoned Montgomery. The meeting was tense. Eisenhower laid out Churchill's framework. First Army would revert to Bradley at once. Ninth Army would remain under Montgomery, but only for Operation Plunder, the Rhine crossing. Once the Rhine was secured and a bridgehead established, the Ninth Army too would return to Bradley's 12th Army Group. This was not a suggestion, nor a topic for debate. It was a direct order. Montgomery protested. How could he plan subsequent operations into the heart of Germany if he did not know his force structure? Eisenhower was unmoved. The decision was final. Montgomery was presented with his choice: accept command of one American army on a strictly temporary mission-specific basis, or relinquish command of both immediately and lead only his British and Canadian troops for the remainder of the war. Faced with this binary choice, the Field Marshal acquiesced. It was a bitter pill. He had been reduced from the prospective overall ground commander of the main thrust to a temporary custodian of a borrowed army. The political theater was not complete. Churchill, to repair the damage Montgomery's ego had inflicted on the alliance, performed a humiliating but necessary act of political submission. On January 18th, before the House of Commons, he publicly acknowledged the new reality of the alliance. In the campaign of 1944, the United States forces have done almost all the fighting and have suffered almost all the losses. They have lost 7 men to our 1. It was a stark, painful admission of Britain's transition from senior to junior partner, a moment that highlighted how profoundly the world had changed since 1939. For the next 2 months, Montgomery's headquarters meticulously planned Operation Plunder. It was to be a colossal, methodical set piece, reminiscent of El Alamein. Nothing would be left to chance. Massive artillery bombardments, elaborate deception plans, and the deployment of 2 airborne divisions, 1 British, 1 American, in Operation Varsity would precede and support the assault. The Ninth Army, under General Simpson, was tasked with the southern wing of the attack, crossing the Rhine north of the Ruhr. Simpson and his staff cooperated professionally with Montgomery's team. Simpson respected Montgomery's thoroughness, and the planning was undeniably impressive in its scope and detail. Yet an uneasy undercurrent persisted. American officers within Ninth Army HQ noticed that Montgomery's staff, in their planning for the exploitation phase beyond the Rhine, routinely included Ninth Army in their operational maps and orders. There was no discussion of the temporary nature of the command, as if the temporary nature had been quietly forgotten, or simply assumed to be reversible. This behavior had a haunting precedent: Operation Martin Garden that September. In that disaster, Montgomery dismissed clear intelligence warnings, pushed ahead with his single-thrust strategy, using predominantly American and Polish airborne troops, and upon failure, famously declared it 90% successful. He had faced no meaningful consequence from Eisenhower for that costly misadventure. Now, many Americans, particularly Bradley and Patton, feared a repeat. Montgomery would use the operational momentum of a successful Rhine crossing to argue that he must retain Ninth Army for the next vital phase, trapping Eisenhower in a cycle of temporary commands that became permanent. Eisenhower knew, as he always did, with a calm, impassive face. When Montgomery finished, Eisenhower's reply was simple and final. The command arrangement had been temporary. The armies would return to Bradley's command. The broad front strategy would continue. Montgomery was stunned. He saw this not as a strategic disagreement, but as a political surrender. Eisenhower, in his view, was sacrificing military logic to placate American national pride. He left the meeting in a cold fury, convinced the Allied cause was being jeopardized by sentiment. He was half right. It was about American pride, but it was also about fundamental command authority. Bradley's position had crystallized into an unshakable principle. The temporary transfer during the Bulge was one thing. Making it permanent was an entirely different proposition. To Bradley, it...
Undeterred, Operation Plunder was launched on the night of March 23rd. It was a spectacular, thunderous success. A staggering artillery barrage lit up the night sky.
The next day, Operation Varsity dropped thousands of airborne troops behind German lines. Under this umbrella, the assault boats crossed. Ninth Army, fighting fiercely, established its own bridgehead. Montgomery's meticulous planning had yielded a victory with remarkably low casualties for an operation of its scale. He was justifiably proud. But Patton's shadow loomed large. American newspapers contrasted the two crossings, Montgomery's colossal, pre-announced hammer blow and Patton's swift, opportunistic jab. The former was admired, the latter was celebrated as quintessentially American. More importantly, Patton had proven that the Rhine was not an impregnable fortress requiring months of buildup. Now came the moment Eisenhower had anticipated and Bradley had feared. With the Rhine crossed, Montgomery immediately argued that the next phase, the encirclement of the Ruhr industrial region, required continued unity of command. Ninth Army, positioned perfectly on the southern pincer of the encirclement, could not be transferred in the middle of such a delicate operational maneuver. To do so would be militarily unsound. He pressed Eisenhower to extend his command of Ninth Army indefinitely. For Bradley and Patton, this was the old pattern repeating itself. Montgomery was using operational success as a lever to pry permanent control from the Supreme Commander. The irony was galling. Patton vividly remembered how his own Third Army had been starved of fuel and supplies in September 1944 to support Montgomery's failed market garden gamble. Now, Montgomery seemed to be attempting to commandeer American resources once again. Eisenhower, however, was prepared. Montgomery had been given his explicit terms, one army for one operation. The operation was complete. The bridgehead was secure. The time had come. Bradley, with Patton's full support, demanded the return of Ninth Army. This time, Eisenhower agreed without hesitation. VII, the reckoning and the new reality. On April 4, 1945, the U.S. Ninth Army was formally transferred back to the command of Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group. The order was unambiguous and final. Montgomery protested vehemently to Churchill, claiming it would cripple his northern advance. But Churchill, the great defender of British interests, did not intervene. The political capital for this fight had been spent. The compromise of January had held just long enough to get across the Rhine. To relitigate it now was impossible. Britain's ability to direct Allied strategy was over. The consequences were immediate and profound. Montgomery's 21st Army Group, now consisting solely of British and Canadian forces, advanced into northern Germany and the Netherlands. They fought hard, liberated starving Dutch civilians, and accepted the German surrender in their sector on May 4th at Lüneburg Heath. But they were one Allied force among several. The great, concentrated northern thrust to Berlin, Montgomery's dream, was impossible without American divisions. That dream had died not in the fields of Germany, but in the aftermath of a vainglorious press conference. Meanwhile, the reunited American 12th Army Group, with Hodges' 1st and Simpson's 9th Armies back under its wing, became the overwhelming central force of the Western Front. They completed the Ruhr encirclement, trapping over 300,000 German soldiers. They raced across Germany, with Simpson's 9th Army famously linking up with the Soviet Red Army at the Elbe River on April 25, 1945. Eisenhower's lonely compromise had succeeded, but its success revealed a hard truth. By giving Montgomery the 9th Army temporarily, he had not only appeased British strategic sensibilities, but had also set up a final, definitive test. The test proved that even with a full American army under his command, Montgomery's operational tempo could not match the aggressive, mobile warfare of pure American commands. Patton crossed the Rhine first. American armies now advanced into the heart of Germany faster than the methodical 21st Army Group. VII. Conclusion: the seamstress's art. The crisis of January 1945 was the climactic moment of Anglo-American tension in World War II. It was not merely a clash of personalities, though the personalities were titanic.
It was a collision between a fading imperial power desperate to retain influence and a rising superpower determined to claim the leadership it had earned through blood and treasure. It was a conflict between two military doctrines, the British tradition of deliberate, set-piece battles and the American emphasis on speed, flexibility, and mass. Dwight Eisenhower, in this maelstrom, was neither brilliant strategist nor a charismatic battlefield leader. He was something more essential, a supreme political general, a seamstress of alliance. His genius lay in understanding that winning the war required keeping the coalition intact, and that required a compromise that left all parties dissatisfied but still committed. He gave Montgomery enough rope, a single American army, a single river crossing, to demonstrate his method and, inadvertently, his limitations. He gave Bradley and Patton the assurance that their sacrifice and their command would be respected, but not at the immediate cost of an irreparable British rupture. In the end, Montgomery's vision was not defeated by German arms, but by his own fatal inability to grasp the politics of coalition. He believed military logic should trump all. Eisenhower knew that in an alliance of democracies, military logic is always in dialogue with national pride, political reality, and personal trust. Montgomery shattered that trust in a room full of journalists. Everything that followed, the humiliating apology, the reduced command, the final loss of Ninth Army, flowed from that moment. The lesson of January 1945 is the fundamental lesson of coalition warfare. Victory requires more than just defeating the enemy. It requires the relentless, thankless, and often lonely work of stitching together disparate interests, egos, and national destinies into a single, fraying, but ultimately unbreakable thread. Eisenhower, the seamstress, held that thread together long enough to sew up the fate of the Third Reich. In doing so, he not only won the war, but also defined the uneasy, essential art of leading a coalition of the free.